Hi everyone, my name is Joe Kwan and I'm a research assistant in the Computational Cog-Sci lab at MIT. And today I'll be sharing our work on flexibility and moral cognition and asking when is it okay to break the rules? So there are many important cognitive processes that drive our moral cognition, and these include things like heuristics and biases to careful reasoning and decision making. In addition to that, the main drivers of moral cognition appear complex and interactive. But one primary component of human moral cognition that's been studied and incorporated in many moral theories over the past decades is the role of rules. Almost every contemporary theory of moral psychology has some role for rules, and each of these theories uses moral rules as a way of explaining moral judgment, cognition, and reasoning. In these theories of moral psychology, moral rules are thought of as simple and articulable algorithms that operate over scenarios. They include things like don't lie, don't steal, and don't cut in line. And these rules shape our everyday experience of moral decision making and seem to be taken seriously in all societies. Breaking them is a serious offense that can result in a variety of punishments like social sanctions, various forms of ostracization, time in prison, or even capital punishment. But there are also plenty of exceptions to rules. For example, in certain situations, people will say it's okay to tell a white lie, or if you take a roommate's EpiPen while they're away in order to help your friend with a severe allergic reaction, but you replace it afterwards, it's pretty unlikely that your roommate's going to make a fuss about it. So why do we find exceptions to rules so often, despite how seriously we take them? Well, rules are written to cover a wide range of cases as broad generalizations, so they will sometimes get the wrong answer. It's immediately apparent that we know that we can sometimes override and ignore the rules. In our experiments, we studied this ability to decide when it's okay to break the rule by focusing on the paradigm of queuing up in lines. The standard rule is that you should get in the back of the line and wait your turn. But there are lots of exceptions to this. For example, there are sometimes emergencies that can make cutting to the front of the line feel okay. So how do we know when it's okay to break the rule of staying in a line? Our hypothesized answer is that we can ask ourselves, what is the function of this rule? We can reason about what purpose the rule is serving, and if it's not actually being upheld, then we can decide not to follow the rule. So in our case, we're asking, what is the function of the line rule? And one of the central functions underlying the rule about queuing up and waiting your place in line is ensuring fairness. The rule about lines ensures fairness by treating each person's claim to the resource as equivalent, and we operationalize this idea through universalization. So in a given situation, if everyone else can do what you're doing, then you're not taking any special privilege for yourself that you couldn't grant to others. And if you decide to leave a line, but everyone else could also leave the line without undermining the fairness, then it seems okay to break the rule about staying in line. So here's an example of a stimulus that participants would view to get a sense of what our setup looked like. And for our studies, we created a video game grid world where there were 8 agents, and their goal was to collect water and bring it back to store in a wooden barrel, like what's shown on the left side of the map here. So I'm going to let it loop one more time. So here you see a person getting out of line and speeding to the front in order to cut in and get the water more quickly, while the others are moving through to collect the water in order. If asked, was this person's getting out of line okay? Most of us would probably say no. But in this video, we also see an agent leaving the line to collect water more quickly, yet it doesn't seem quite so bad. So why do we judge these cases so differently if they each involve one person getting out of line and going for the water? Our hypothesis is that in the first case, the agent's action can't be universalized, so it violates the function of the rule about waiting in line. In the second case, if everyone felt at liberty to leave the line, nothing bad would happen. So when someone gets out of line, they're not violating the fairness function. We refer to these first kinds of cases as line necessary, and the second kind of cases as no line necessary. We operationalize whether a line is necessary for ensuring fairness by asking whether or not the action of leaving the line to get to the water is universalizable. In the line necessary cases, there's a large difference in group utility. And what I mean by this is basically the total amount of time it takes for all the agents to complete the task of collecting and storing the water. On the other hand, in our no line necessary cases, if you look at the resulting group utility, when someone leaves the line versus when no one leaves the line, there's either a small difference or no difference at all. And the videos here, leaving the line in the no line necessary case is universalizable because everyone can leave the line and obtain water without any problems. But in the line necessary case, if people leave the line to obtain the water more quickly, things get very chaotic and they aren't treating everyone's claim to the resource as equivalent. We created 4 maps in the line necessary case and 3 in the no line necessary case. And briefly, to build some more intuition, here's a visual of the various stimuli we had in each of the conditions. Okay, so we ran 3 studies, and in the first study, we test our hypothesis. Do people use their understanding of the functional principle of rules to make flexible moral judgments? In the second study, we scope out a concern about an alternative explanation involving utilitarian judgments. And in our third study, we make some more fine-grained predictions and see if judgments on universalizability can directly predict moral permissibility judgments. We showed videos of various maps, and each were distinctly novel in visuospatial settings. And then we asked the participants to make judgments about the moral permissibility of one target agent who they would be focusing on during the video. There are 2 example maps here, where on the left, the environment is one where a line seems to be necessary. So if everyone wanted to leave the line to get to the water more quickly, things wouldn't turn out so well. And on the right, a line doesn't seem necessary because there are multiple access points along the stream. So if everyone wanted to leave the line to get to the water, they could do so without messing things up for everyone else. Here's our first study. We asked participants to watch the video where the target agent is leaving the line to get the water more quickly. And then we asked them whether their actions were morally permissible or not. And our central manipulation of interest was the arrangement of the water sources, which determined whether a line was necessary or not. And we also manipulated the number of agents leaving the line. On the x-axis of this figure, we have the no line necessary and line necessary cases, with the y-axis showing the percentage of participants that judged leaving the line as morally permissible. And we found that moral judgments about agents leaving the line and the line necessary cases were much harsher than those about agents leaving the line and no line necessary cases. So we observed that people aren't always relying on the straightforward rule of staying in line, and that people do in fact recognize when the rule about waiting in line can be broken. Another interesting thing was that in study 1, we found that the number of line leavers had an effect on moral permissibility judgments. So as the number of people leaving the line increased, the acceptability of leaving the line also increased. I think one possibility is that because we never explicitly stated the rule of staying in line, people questioned whether such a rule even existed, or they never perceived staying in a line as a rule in the first place. Okay. We found that people do indeed use their understanding of the functional principle of rules to make flexible moral judgments in novel scenarios. And someone might be concerned that the subjects are using are global utility maximizers that aren't using universalization, and they're actually judging the person for getting out of line because this might start a cascade of line leavers, which ultimately reduces utility. So this is the main point of concern that we address in study 2. And to explain in a bit more detail, there's a concern that if someone leaves the line, it'll lead to others also deciding to leave the line, and this just results in chaos and a plummet in expected utility. So we designed a similar experiment, but we set it up with a lock-in mechanism. And participants were told that all the agents individually locked in a choice to stay in line or leave the line before the game began. And once the game began, none of the agents who had locked in their choice could change their minds and behave differently. Only the target agent whose actions the participant would be judging had the unique freedom to decide how to act during the game and not lock in their decision beforehand. And by introducing this lock-in setup as context for the game, we eliminate the worry that subjects are making their judgments by imagining that a single line lever would encourage others to follow suit and therefore lead to a large overall negative utility. We had a line necessary case and a no line necessary case, which were just 2 of the simplest maps from study 1 in terms of visuospatial and environment layout. And either no one left the line, which we tested as a control case, or just one target agent left the line. And additionally, the amount of time it took for the task to be completed was the same across all 4 of our conditions. We found that participants still judged the action of leaving the line as less morally acceptable in the line necessary cases. Again, the x-axis represents the line necessary and the line necessary cases, and the y-axis again represents the percentage of participants saying that the action was morally permissible. And we see what we expect in the control cases in red, where not leaving the line is perfectly permissible. But when the target agent leaves the line, their actions are judged as morally impermissible, even when a line is necessary. There's no substantial change in these permissibility judgments from study 1. So the subjects were not, in fact, making their moral judgments based on worries about chain reaction effects of getting out of line, and its resulting drop in utility. And they judged similarly despite knowing that all other agents definitely would not leave the line. Also, despite the total time to complete the task being held the same across all of the stimuli, which is one measure for group utility, we still observe very different moral permissibility judgments between the line necessary and no line necessary cases. So subjects aren't making moral judgments based on actual delay times because the time is constant across stimuli, and they aren't making moral judgments because of concerns about potential downstream consequences of getting out of line. The knowledge of the function of the rule about waiting in line better explains the pattern of judgments here and in study 1. And moving on to our final study, we wanted to make some more fine-grained predictions and see if people's judgments about the universalizability of leaving the line and preserving fairness would predict moral permissibility judgments. So here we ran an experiment similar to the first, except in addition to our 7 line necessary and no line necessary cases, we also included 6 maps labeled maybe line necessary, where there's ambiguity about the universalizability of getting out of line. So in the maybe line necessary cases, it's not so straightforward or obvious whether leaving the line is universalizable. And we induce this uncertainty by cutting the video short, which you'll see shortly. So the participants view only the first few frames of the video, and they don't get to see how the entire thing unfolds. On the left, there's uncertainty about whether the agent is going to go right and block the path of the people returning with the water, or whether the agent's going to go further and to the end of the stream, where there's not going to be any obstruction of the line. So there's uncertainty here about which policy the agent has. And on the right, the policy is pretty clear. The agent's going to go down and access the water from the bottom of the stream, but it's uncertain whether the agent will be able to do so without blocking those who are staying in line and queuing to the water from the top of the map, and thereby messing things up for all of the others. So this is an uncertainty about the outcome that will result from the agent's actions. Now, we can ask participants about how universalizable they think the action is directly, and see how well it predicts moral permissibility judgments in a graded range. Specifically, we asked participants how much better or worse off everyone would be if everyone felt at liberty to leave the line to try to get to the water. And participants responded with a continuous sliding scale that's shown here from -50 labeled much worse off to 0 labeled the same to 50 labeled much better off. And we find that the percentage of judgments of the target agent's actions being morally permissible correspond quite well with the cases we designed. So the figure on the left shows this kind of graded response in the results about whether the agent leaving the line was morally acceptable or not. The red bars indicate permissibility judgments on our line necessary maps, the blue on the maybe line necessary maps, and the green bars indicate the permissibility judgments on the no line necessary cases. And on the right, we can see that the participants' judgments on universalizability correlate very closely with moral acceptability judgments across a wide range of line cutting cases. So the main finding of study 3 is that subject inferences about the universalizability of leaving the line is a strong predictor of the moral permissibility in completely novel cases. This suggests that subjects use their generative understanding of the rule about waiting in line to make moral judgments, which are predictable by understanding the function of the rule. So to sum up, in this project, we found that moral rules are not set in stone, and we're able to make flexible judgments about when it's okay to break the rules. We find evidence that we're able to make these flexible decisions because we understand the function underlying the rule and are able to identify situations in which the function is not being served. We rule out the worry that these judgments may be affected by utilitarian calculation, and we also find that people's universalization judgments are a great predictor of how they judge when it's okay to break the rule. Now, despite our studies focusing on all these cases where perhaps the rule of staying in line is not serving its function for upholding fairness, I'm going to step back for just a moment and acknowledge that rules are extremely helpful because in a majority of situations, it's resource rational to follow the rule. And you don't have to do any time and energy intensive reasoning from the ground up to see if an action might be morally okay or not. Some of the maybe line necessary cases that I showed from study 3 exemplify just how difficult it is to think through everything and eliminate all uncertainty in these multi-agent social interactions. Having this flexible update mechanism to figure out when to break the rules that's founded on understanding the rule's function is a big part of resource rationality. because it allows rules to be flexibly adapted to novel situations and updated as appropriate. This means we don't have to do complex and intensive computations all of the time. If a rule is known by other agents, it also makes coordination much easier to pull off. And if you aren't thinking the entire time about what the best possible way to maximize your utility might be in every single particular situation, it also buys you time to use your cognitive resources for other things. And these specificities with bounded rationality with limits in computation, especially in complex and dynamic environments with many other social agents, are things we'd like to nail down more concretely. So moving forward, there remain interesting questions that were raised in our studies. We want to begin work on modeling moral permissibility judgments in the paradigm of PDDL, or planning domain definition language, which lets us clearly define our setting as a multi-agent planning problem. This allows us to make more fine-grained and precise quantitative predictions. Some things that multi-agent modeling will help us with include quantifying things like computational complexity and cost of various mental processes, as well as measurement of things like counterfactual variance and individual agents' utilities in each of the environments, and the chaos that will ensue when agents sleep align. Maybe we can attempt to get this with measures of variance and utility and some metric for unpredictability. And finally, we ran all our experiments with participants in the US, and we're in the process of collecting more information by running these experiments cross-culturally, or perhaps we'll find something interesting from the varying attitudes and norms and other things due to cultures interfacing with the specific rule of lines differently. So that's all for our work, and thanks very much for listening. I hope you found some of this work interesting and insightful.
Hi, that was a really interesting presentation, and really cool set of studies. I was wondering about like a possible alternate interpretation of the results, which could be that like the rule that you identified is incorrect. So instead of like the rule being you can't leave the line, the rule is you can't cut in front of someone. And in this case, it might be that people are still following a rule that's just like don't cut in front of other people in the line, or even more general rule of just like
Yeah,
be fair. Yeah.
yeah. So that's a great question. Um, there was one thing I mentioned, which was that like in, for example, study one, all of the videos sort of started off with everyone in like this visual setting where everyone's sort of in a line, but we never said like, we never told the participants, look, there is this rule that you have to follow, and this rule means like stay in line and don't get in front of everyone and stuff like that. And addressing that point, I think like what I'm thinking is that, you know, in a lot of day-to-day scenarios, like people will not basically like, for example, there's like a line at TSA or something. There's not always like explicitly a thing where you like get to a point and they're like, look, there's this rule and you have to get in line. By the way, it's more of like we sort of see the environment and how it's laid out. We see what the other people are doing, and then we sort of infer that there's this like line following rule going on. More specifically to your question, I went over this quite quickly for the interest of time, but there are actually situations in which, so if I'm correct, your question is like, there's like this rule of staying in line, but also there's like room for ambiguity in terms of like, what specific thing is there? Like, is it like you cannot get in front of a person physically, or
Yeah,
is that?
yeah. I guess I'm just saying that there might be like
Mhm,
a more important role at play, which is
mhm.
to not cut in front of someone rather than like uh just leaving the line.
Yeah, so I would be happy to talk to you in more detail about why I think this setup is pretty robust to that concern. But I
Hmm.
think one thing that I might point your attention to is in this one, for example, where there's like different possible ways of so there's a line here, but
Hmm.
there's a bottleneck here where like you could either have one person going in and then coming out, and then the next person goes in and comes out, or
Hmm.
you could have it so that like, you know, three people are going in, which is a little more efficient, and people go out, these three people go in and go out, and so on.
Yeah.
So you could imagine a scenario where like one person is going in at a time, which is like kind of inefficient, but it's just
Hmm.
how it's going. And then someone from the back sort of comes in here. and without obstructing it, because they time it correctly, they sort of follow it and go up.
Mhm.
And in that case, they're cutting all of these people.
Yeah.
But I would suspect that people would have varied judgments here about whether that's morally permissible or not, just because, like, on one hand, you're like cutting in front and that feels wrong. On the other hand, you're doing it smoothly and it actually makes things faster for the people behind you.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like, I think, yeah, there are some more complex scenarios to look at that question in more detail, but I suspect that, yeah, I
Yeah.
think, I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, that's
Uh-huh.
I think that's a pretty good explanation. I think that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Cool.
Thank you.
We have one virtual question that says, hi, if no one follows a moral rule, is it still considered a rule even if it is explicitly mentioned?
That's an interesting question that I feel like is more contingent on sort of how we're labeling and putting the terms on moral rules. Yeah, I think that sort of gets at the distinction you could make between like socially accepted conventions and rules versus like me saying like, okay, there's this rule now, which is everyone has to hop on their right foot only as they exit this room. And I don't know, like, is that a rule? Possibly, if you define it that way. Yeah, I don't know if that was, I'm not really sure that answered the question. Yeah.
Are there ways that you're imagining how you might, so I like the idea of showing how rules can be stupid, and that sometimes it's acceptable to break stupid rules, and that seems pretty common. Is there a way that you're imagining how you could study something similar where it's morally acceptable to break a rule in a way that's clearly unfair, right? So, you know, I'm thinking of cultures where, you know, line cutting is maybe some, you know, like I have friends from Brazil, for example, where they tell me like cutting in line is more frequent as long as you can kind of explain why you need to cut in line, like, and do so sort of creatively and sort of you know, use your kind of social skills to get away with these kinds of morally flexible violations. And I don't know how you test this paradigm, but I could imagine, like, you know, if you showed someone, you know, with a cane, just sort of slowly walking up because it seemed like it would be unpleasant for them to stand in line, maybe that would get at something different.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So, yeah, in this specific scenario, just because of the way that we set up the stimuli, it's like we're sort of treating everyone as like doing the same sort of thing, and there's not like really an urgency sort of thing. So we didn't really include information like, by the way, this person in the blue shirt has to get water quickly, or their sibling is going to be dehydrated and pass away, or something like that. That's something that's sort of here that's like not really captured in our environment. I think it'd be really interesting to look into that. But I think I definitely would agree that even, or at least my intuition is that even in the US participants, if like you brought in additional complications that had to do with like how it relates to how important it is for the specific person to get the resource more quickly or something like that, I have a feeling that would play a pretty strong factor in like judging the permissibility thing. But yeah, I think the overall thing here is that, like, you know, like, I'm not saying that rules are stupid, but that they might be stupid in certain situations. Yeah, where it's not really serving its purpose very well. Yeah, so just
Thanks.